the Christian Circle podcast, and you're listening to Pamela Fernandes, where we have conversations about Christian living. Here's the show.
Well, he was kind of I guess you'd call him a rake.
Okay.
He wasn't really a very virtuous man. wasn't moral at all, and he had a lot of issues. Just like it seems like the common thread through most of the great saints is that they didn't grow up as choir boys. God knew what he was doing by taking these people that really weren't the best of the best. Like St. Paul had blood on his hands, and St. Augustine, he had a child out of wedlock with a woman that may or may not have been married to another man. You got all these different, like St. Francis of Assisi, he lived kind of a little bit on the edge life when he was younger too. So it was all these different people that the most, really it's like the most famous of the saints that we know of really had this pattern of, kind of off the rails youth, a moment of conversion, and then just complete dedication to God. And St. Augustine's really the same. The same and so much different at the same time, because he went on to become, one of the greatest fathers of the church that we have, and a lot of Western thought and Western philosophy and Western Christianity is really based upon his teachings and writings and everything.
Was he a rich man? I mean, what was his family background like? I mean, we do know that his mother also ended up being canonized as a saint. So what was
St. Monica.
Yeah, St. Monica.
I believe his mother was a Christian. She was a Christian the whole way through. It was probably her prayers that really brought him around. But the father, I think I read that the father was a Christian, and I also read that the father wasn't a Christian. I don't know if we really know very, very much detail about him. As far as I found out, he wasn't a Christian, but he grew up in North Africa, what's now Algeria, and he's from a plebeian family in Roman society, but I don't think they were ultra rich, but they also weren't peasants either. Kind of middle class, I guess, as much as middle class would be in the ancient world. But he came from North Africa, and his mother was a Christian, and so he was raised kind of like nominally Christian, but he really started straying even as a child. Like later on in his confessions, he would write that as a child he would go and do bad things, steal things or hurt animals or whatever, and not because he wanted the things that he was doing, or not just because they were bad. Like that's how bad he was as a kid, that he would do things just to do wrong, because he knew he wasn't supposed to, so that's why he would do it. That was his motivation.
And he was quite an intellectual man, wasn't he? I mean, he was a professor who was teaching philosophy and all these big subjects. So he's actually, in a sense, an educated man, a man who can think for himself, a man who really thinks, and he's very logical about it.
Yeah, when he was in college, it's kind of the typical story too of, so many people nowadays in the church is you're raised a Christian, he went off to college, and in college he was exposed to all these other ideas and stuff, and he ended up becoming a Manichaean. And that probably broke his mother's heart, as I imagine there's lots of mothers out there that their children have drifted away from the faith, and it's broke their heart. But they can be hardened by no matter what happens, like St. Paul or whatever, you can always come back. Just like St. Augustine really had a conversion later on in life and got baptized later on, so that means he wasn't baptized as a child, so he didn't really come back. But in a sense he did, because he was raised by a Christian mother. He went on to become a professor in Carthage, which would have been like the main Roman city in the area. And there was a Roman official, like from the imperial court. At the time, the imperial court was in Milan, and there was a Roman official from the imperial court that was so impressed by his speaking skills and stuff that he invited him to come become a professor in Milan, which would have been like the most prestigious like law professor position there would have been in the Roman Empire at the time. So he must have been pretty good at speaking to get that invitation.
So in a way, he did have some qualifications before. Like you see this with a number of saints, so they didn't realize that they were being qualified, through the years as they come closer.
Yeah, the kind of thing that they can look back on and say, like, well, God put me in this position to write these books on theology and philosophy. And in my training at Carthage and in Milan and all these different steps along the way, he was being kind of groomed for this. But at the time, you wouldn't see that. But it's kind of one of them hindsight is 20/20 thing. We can see it perfectly 1,600 years later. But at the time, he would have just thought he was just going on with his life. But God had his steps kind of planned out the whole way.
So what is this turning point where he has this crisis of, of faith under the influence of Ambrose, and then he just, changing, and his whole life changes, I think.
Right.
I don't know how old he is then, but everything changes from then on.
Right. It starts before he left for Milan. He had a run-in with, there was the Manichaeans had bishops too.
Okay.
And because it was kind of a cross between like Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism. It was kind of a mixture of lots of different things. And they had bishops, and there was a bishop named, I think it was Faustian or Faust.
Okay.
Faustus, I think it was. Yeah, it was Faustus. And he would ask all these different men, because it's as a Gnostic religion, you only know so much as you're kind of initiated into it. So when you first get in, it isn't like when I became a Catholic, they handed me the catechism of the Catholic Church and said, here you go, this is everything we believe. As a Manichaean, you would have got handed maybe 3 or 4 chapters. And then each level you go, kind of like Scientology is today, each level you go up the ladder, you learn more of this like revealed truth. And so he had all these questions, because he was always searching for truth. And he had all these questions, and everyone would tell him, oh, when you meet Bishop Faustus, he'll have the answers for you. Oh, when you meet Bishop Faustus, and he wrote about this in his Confessions. It was kind of his autobiography he wrote later on in life. And when he met Faustus, he was utterly disappointed. Every time he would ask him a question, it was a deep and hard probing question, he would either deflect or just answer it in such a, shallow way that it left him feeling like Faustus didn't really have the answers. So by the time he leaves for Milan, he's not a Christian by any means, but he's really having major doubts about Manichaeism. He has his faith in that whole system shaken, because he realized that this whole revealed truth thing, and as you go deeper and deeper in Gnosticism in general, is all just baloney, really. And it's all just a way to kind of keep you entangled in it. Whereas Christianity, once you become a Christian, like they kept some things secret back in the day during the persecution and stuff, because they didn't want to be found out by the authorities and stuff. But there was no secret teachings. There was no secret knowledge. Everything was out in the open. And then when he gets to Milan, he ends up meeting Ambrose, who was the bishop of Milan. And as a like a law professor, he was impressed by Ambrose's speaking style and the way he would project and the way he could command a crowd and stuff. So he started listening to him, not even so much for religious education, but just because he liked his style. Struck up a friendship with him, and then it was from that friendship that they have a lot of deep conversations and stuff. And he started kind of becoming more intrigued with the faith of his mother, Monica. And it was through that that he had that kind of touchstone with her. He had that the exposure to it as a youth, and it kind of started. I guess it started kind of bringing back memories and stuff. But it was really more of a miraculous moment, just like St. Paul wrote to Damascus. He had this emptiness inside of him, and he would later.
I wanted to ask you, since you mentioned this, how is it that in your own personal life, have you seen this happen, that suddenly you're somewhere, you have all these doubts, and then you realize that there is an answer somewhere else? I know this isn't part of the normal questions that we did, but you yourself would have experienced this with your own life, right? That you're in something, you have all these doubts the way he did, and then you know that there is something that is missing. How do you address that? How do you know that there is an answer out there? What made you think that, okay, there's an answer in another church or in another faith or in something else?
Right. Well, that's that's a hard one, huh?
Well, okay, you can come back to it later. So.
Well, no, there's truth out there, and God is truth. And as a Christian, God isn't just truth. I think it was I think it was Paul.VI maybe. It said, or it might have been Pope Pius XII, that God isn't just true, he's truth himself. It's like when Jesus said to Pilate, when Pilate said, what is truth? Pilate was just kind of being flippant and kind of thinking he was being cool, saying like, what is truth? And just blowing Jesus off. But here was truth, the embodiment of truth itself. standing right next to him. And that is, I knew there was truth out there, and I've always been a Christian. Just kind of, when I was younger, I didn't really take it as seriously as I should have. But I kind of had after my father passed away, I kind of had this like moment of, if this is true, is it true? And I come to believe, yes, it is true. And if it's true, then it's the most important thing in the world. And it isn't to be taken so lightly. It isn't. If it isn't true, I've got a lot better things to do with my Sunday than, I go to Mass Sunday morning, and I volunteered at RCIA, so I'm at church from like 8:30 till 12:30 every Sunday. I have a lot better things to do. I could sleep in on Sunday because I work 6 days a week, so I could sleep in on Sunday. Or I could, get up and go skiing up in the mountains, or I could there's plenty of things I could think of to do if it wasn't true. So why go through the motions? That's what I kind of had. I don't know if you call it a St. Paul moment, because I didn't convert, like when I converted to Catholicism, but I was always a Christian. But it was kind of this, I had this moment, it was immediately following my father's death, maybe within a few days or weeks, that if this is something that I believe in, and if it's true, then I have to dedicate my life to it more. I can't just show up on Sunday, go through the motions, leave, and then be a Christian 1 hour a week. I have to be a Christian 7 days a week, And so that was kind of I guess you'd call that my Augustine moment.
So when he starts off as he comes back to his mother, and he's alive, I think, when he makes this change, right?
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, it was like I said, it was kind of a miraculous moment for him. He's sitting, and he just read a book. I think Ambrose actually gave him the book, and it was St. Anthony of the Desert. And it was a biography. It was one of the first biographies of a saint, and it was written by, I want to say, St. Athanasius. It was written by Athanasius, and he reads it, and he's really intrigued, and it's kind of really stirring all these thoughts in him and stuff, and he's sitting there, and he's trying to grapple with all this, what is truth, and what is, what am I going to do with my life? Like, I really got to kind of get things squared around here. And he hears a voice. He goes out and he walks out in a garden outside the house he was staying in, and he hears a voice saying, "Take and read." And he hears, say, 3 or 4 times, but it's like a child's voice, he described it as, and it says, "Take and read, take and read." And he walks and he comes across and hears a Bible, and it's open to Paul's letter to the Romans. And he starts reading, and it's about the particular part he turns to is Romans 13 through 14. And that was the part that he picked up and read, and that's really it was God showing him, this is what I desire of you. It says, "Let us conduct ourselves becoming as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provisions for the flesh to gratify its desires." So that was it was written for someone like Augustine. And so he read that because he had a mistress that he'd been with for 20-something years, and he had a son that was to this mistress, and he had all these different things going on. And he had one of his famous things that he said was, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet."
Yes.
So, at the back of your mind, St. Paul said, and I think it was chapter 1 of Romans, that even though they didn't have the law of the Romans, they still had, the natural law that right from wrong, and the deepness of your heart. Someone in the jungles in the Amazon knows that murdering their relative is wrong. It's just kind of natural. It's a natural law. So he knew that this affair that he'd been carrying on for 15 or 20 years, and the way he'd been going on this drunken, debauched life was wrong. And then he picks this up. He hears this voice, and this just happens to be open to this particular passage. And he reads that, and that was just kind of like I said, the road to Damascus moment for him, and just kind of opened his eyes.
Yeah.
Ambrose, and received baptism from Ambrose. That was it. He decided he needed to get in on this.
Is that where he now becomes a priest, or is that?
No, it wasn't until he returned back to Hippo, which was in North Africa. He returned back to Hippo, and he was there. He studied and stuff. He went back with his son, but then his son ended up dying.
Yeah.
And so I think he got ordained a priest after his mother died before they went back to Hippo. She died right after, but he was baptized before she died. And then he went back to Hippo, and his son ended up dying a couple of years later, and then he became ordained a priest after that.
So after being a priest for all the years later, then he even ends up being a bishop, and he has all these things that he's written about that honestly I don't even understand. So what are some of the most famous things, especially since we're in January and there are lots of people who are now falling back on their resolutions. They want to look at something that is hopeful. So in looking at that, what is some of the things that Saint Augustine has said or written about that would give these people, give all of us actually, some hope of how we can rectify things?
Right. Well, his most famous, I'd say his two most famous works was Confessions. I've talked about that a few times already, and that was like his autobiography that he wrote about himself, and that's where you get a lot of the information too about his conversion and his youth and everything is all from that. And then he wrote The City of God, and The City of God is probably one of the most famous writings in Christian philosophy, I guess you'd call it. In The City of God, he wrote that in the early 400s. Rome had just fallen, so he's back in North Africa, and Rome had just fallen to the Goths, the Vandals. They just sacked Rome, and the people of Rome they were saying to themselves that this is what we get for abandoning our ancient gods, and going with the Christian God. And so he writes this book, and in it, he's trying to console them by saying that things of this earth are only for this moment. Like they're passing away. Like this reading coming up this Sunday is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and the things of this world are a vapor. They're passing away. The city of God is what we're striving towards, and you gotta be a citizen of the city of God, not of the city of men. And he goes on in the book and he talks about the city of man and the inhabitants of the city of man, and how they were saying like the good old days of ancient Rome and the power of Rome. And he goes on and he writes this whole book about how Rome was really a debauched place. It was a terrible place. The pagan gods were terrible gods. Like there's all this. Then he talks about how Christianity has brought out the good in people, and he goes on to say about how we gotta look to the things of God and not the things of man. And even though the city's destroyed, even though things might look grim right now, it'll look up in the future because this world's not our home. Like that old Southern gospel song, "This world's not my home, I'm only passing through." And that's he develops a lot of doctrine too in these books. So there aren't just philosophical writings. They've got a lot of doctrine going on. And like the doctrine of original sin is really defined. It's really played out in The City of God in his book.
And he writes it from experience, right? Because a lot of his writing is based on what he has been through in his own life. So
right.
He has a different
because he's been firmly a citizen of the city of man. He was its model citizen for a long time. So now, being a bishop, he's trying to bring people over to immigrate to the city of God.
What is one of his theories? I mean, even philosophically. I mean, is there anything that a common man today could use if they weren't reading some of his highly decorated works?
Well, he talked a lot about free will and about like predestination and so what he wrote. Really, it's a strange thing because Catholics and Protestants, Calvinists, non-Calvinists, everyone tries to claim Augustine's writings as their own. So it's like depends on what lens you look at it through.
Okay.
If you look at it through a Calvinist lens, Augustine was the first Calvinist. Okay. If you look at it through a Catholic lens, Augustine wasn't at all. He was really writing against Pelagianism. The theory that Pelagius came up with, that you can, without the grace of God, you can do good on your own and you can come to God through your own will, and that's not so. It's the grace of God is the first step in conversion. Without that grace, you can't even be drawn towards God. But then the Calvinists take it a whole step further and say that you're already preordained towards God. So getting into the whole theory on his philosophy and everything, it really depends on how you're looking at it. But he talked about original sin. And original sin, he really was one of the first people to kind of come up with the idea of original sin, because that predated him, but really kind of flesh it out, and kind of describe it and go into detail in it, how it was Adam sinned. Adam and Eve sinned at the beginning with the fall, and we inherit their sin, but not as an actual sin. It's more of a state that we inherit. And it's kind of the opposite of the good news, the gospel being that Jesus died for all, well, Adam sinned for all.
Yeah.
You know, just like Paul said that with Adam, sin and death entered into the world, but with the new Adam, life comes back into the world.
Yeah.
So he really kind of fleshed that out and went into detail on that so that we can better understand the whole idea of original sin. And its original sin is the reason we need baptism.
Yeah.
Because baptism washes away original sin.
Yeah.
And so he really kind of went into that. And then also he touched on the problem of evil too. If there's an all-good God, if there's an all-good, all-powerful God, but there's evil in the world, then that means either God's neither all-good or all-powerful, or else he would stop the evil.
Yeah.
But it's because of free will that he allows in the world, that he wouldn't allow any evil to happen unless a greater good can come from that evil. You know what I mean? So like different things that might happen as we might think is the worst thing in the world, later on, God uses it for a better purpose to bring out a greater good.
And I think that's important for people who are struggling so much right now, right? I mean, you go through grief, or you go through heartache, or you go through some health issues or whatever, and then you wonder, I mean, where is this God? So it's a nice way of looking at it through Saint Augustine's eyes.
Yeah, it's a nice way to look at it, that no matter what's happening, we can't see it sometimes. Sometimes we won't even see it in this life at all. Maybe it'll be, looking down from heaven, and we're like, oh, okay, that's why that happened. But we have to trust in the providence of God and trust that he is working for the good of those who love him. And it isn't all about like the prosperity gospel of, if you're a Christian, you have enough faith, you'll never get cancer. If you do get cancer, you'll get healed. Or if you don't get healed, you'll go to heaven. Like there's always the next step, as long as you have faith. No, you might die like the apostles. Every single one of them died horrible deaths, except for John, but not for lack of trying. They boiled him alive. But they had great faith. I mean, they had the greatest of all faith. They were there with Jesus. But it didn't keep them from, didn't keep Matthew from getting skinned alive, or Andrew from getting crucified on a cross that was shaped like an X, or Peter upside down. All that happened to them. But through their witness, going to the death like they did, and keeping the faith, they produced, like Tertullian said, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. They might not have seen it in that life. They might have died in agony, screaming and crying, not knowing like what's happening. But we look at it and they're strengthened by their witness, because that's what a martyr is. Martyr means witness, so they're the ultimate witness to the faith. That's what Augustine really expanded on, that the problem of evil, and I think that was really probably the greatest answer there is. And even Aquinas in the Summa Theologica, Thomas Aquinas quoted Augustine when talking about the problem of evil.
In fact, I think even Christ himself had the same. I mean, God didn't save his own son, so it applies to everyone. I mean, especially since you mentioned the crucifixion.
Right, because that's the greatest evil of all, is killing God.
Yeah.
There's really no greater evil than that. And the Pope said it a couple of years ago. Pope Francis said, if you just look at it by human measure, Jesus died alone on a cross. He failed. Just in pure human forms. If you don't know about the resurrection. But since there's a resurrection, then that's the greatest victory of all. But if there was no resurrection, and we just look at it just straight up as like a Roman soldier that was standing there, you'd think, this guy's a failure. Even his friends left him. Only John's standing here and his mother. So one apostle betrayed him, the other 10 left, and there's only one left standing with him. But really, it was the greatest victory. It was literally victory over death.
So what can people do who are struggling with issues just like St. Augustine? I mean, in a way, all of us have some part of our lives that we're struggling with. It's this constant goal towards being saints. So what can people who are struggling learn and apply in their own life from St. Augustine? Prayer from others too, especially. I really think that the prayer of his mother, that's what got St. Monica canonized, was the fact that her constant prayer contributed to her son's turnaround. I believe that, because prayer is effective and prayer works. And she never stopped praying for her son, and eventually he came back. So especially if you've got kids that are away from the church or away from God, that you can keep praying. And God's will is for them to come back. God doesn't want anyone to perish, it says in 1 Peter, but that all will come to repentance. So it's God's will for them to return. You just have to be there and support them and pray for them. And then if it's you that's away, if you've fallen away, or you can always come back too. There's no, as long as there's breath in your lungs, there's hope.
You know, there's no point at which you're too far from God. Augustine was far from God. St. Paul was far from God. All these people were far from God at one point or another. St. Matthew was a tax collector. It's pretty bad, especially in the ancient Jewish world, you know. But you can all be reconciled. Anyone can be reconciled to God. Even the thief on the cross was reconciled with God in the last moments of his life. Don't wait till till you're hanging on a cross. That's definitely not the lesson to learn. But even if you're hanging on a cross with moments to live, you can always come back to God.
Since you mentioned prayer, I just want to add in is that it can take years. I mean, sometimes you're praying for somebody and you're wondering when this turnaround is going to happen, but keep at it. Like, keep praying for whoever that person is, or even yourself.
Right. Yeah, because no prayer is ineffective. You know, as long as you're praying for the will of God to be done, it's not ineffective. God will apply it, you know, as He will. But prayer does work. 100% prayer works. It might not work the way you want it to work, or in the means you want it to work in, but it does work. You know, you can be praying for somebody to get, you know, whatever, to get a job or to get off drugs or whatever you could be praying for, and something else could happen. Like you could be praying for a friend, say, that's having problems like this, that might be addicted to drugs or whatever, and they might get arrested, and you're like, oh, hold on, I didn't pray for that. But maybe in jail they'll get to rehab, or, you know, you don't know how things are going to work out. You just got to keep praying for them.
Also, I think from St. Augustine's life, you can also learn that I think he went through everything. I mean, he went through some of the most difficult things. It's difficult to lose a child. So he's been through a lot of pain and heartache to come back to the Lord. I mean, it must have not been easy. People, the society, people around him, you know, making this transition from being this man to being a priest or whatever. So I think that's one thing also that we need to learn, that when there are people who are changing or transforming their lives, that we need to support them instead of being the people who throw the stones.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself. You know, how many times have you seen somebody come into church or whatever, like trying to be a member of society, that you're like, I know that guy, you know, you know, and you do it, you judge them, and you judge people, and it doesn't make it right. It's just kind of human nature. And I know for myself, I mean, I've had a major like spiritual turnaround in my own life, and I'd hate for people to say like, oh yeah, I know that guy, but people do it. It's just the way it is, and we got to not do that. We got to try not to do that. We got to support people. If someone's making a turnaround in their life, if someone wants to start attending church and says like, hey, what church do you go to? You mind if I come with you? Don't say like, oh no, you know, you're a bum. You know, don't do that, because there's plenty of people out there that would do that. Yeah, we definitely got to be supportive of our fellow Christians. You know, if someone's trying to turn their life around, we have to pray for them, to be there for them, to support them, to encourage them. You might be the one encouraging word that someone needs to keep on the path they're on, or you might be the discouraging word to turn them back to their life of sin. You never know how your words are going to affect somebody, so you got to make them the right ones.
I also think, in a way, to the Holy Spirit, I think, in a way, if this take up and read St. Augustine heard, I mean, there's so many times that we are getting a word from either somebody's voice, or we can hear something, somebody speaks to us, there's something on TV, or we read something, and yet we don't pay attention to the prompting of the Holy Spirit. And I think St. Augustine acts on that, whereas a lot of us don't act on it. I mean, we all hear this, but we don't act on it. We think, oh, I can't do this right now, or we have our own priorities instead of what God is asking us to do. So in a way, St. Augustine was very, very brave in listening, despite the intellectual he was, in acting on what he heard.
Yeah, definitely. I think in today's world, we really, you know, it's so loud out there in the world. There's so much, you know, drawing our attention, so much kind of reaching out and trying to grab our attention every moment of the day. I mean, you can't go through 5 minutes without seeing advertising left and right, everything all around you. And really it's difficult to quiet yourself and to take 5, 10, 15 minutes and just find a quiet place in your home and just pray and be with God. It's hard in today's world, especially. I got 3 kids running around the house, and there's no such thing as quiet time. But sometimes you got to go sit in your truck. But it's difficult, you know. But you got to try to find that quiet. That's why he walked outside and he was walking through the garden. And St. Augustine too, he knew and this is a fundamental truth that's true for everyone, is the heart is restless until it rests in you, O Lord. That's one of the truest things, because throughout the world, even in primitive societies and like I said, in the jungles in the Amazon, there's a common thread throughout all humanity, is everyone's searching for God.
Yeah.
They might think that the sun's God, or they might think that the ocean's God. They might have wrong ideas because they haven't had the truth revealed to them in the gospel. But everyone's searching for God. Everyone knows deep in their heart that they were created for a purpose and for a reason.
Yeah.
It isn't just an accident that we're here in this universe. That if the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force was out of whack by just a minuscule amount at the big moment of the Big Bang, the entire universe wouldn't exist.
Well, yeah, true.
And if the Earth was just 1 degree tilted further one on its axis, it would spin out of whack, and the gravity wouldn't be the same as it did. All these different variables, the chances of life existing to begin with, never mind human life, just life, is minuscule. So that isn't by accident. And you aren't by accident. Every person on the earth isn't by accident. You're created with a purpose, and that purpose is to know and love God and to be with Him for all eternity. And inside every human heart, that's just ingrained in your heart. It's written on your heart from the moment you're born. And that's why throughout history, every society, there's never been an atheist society.
Yeah.
Ever. Like, it doesn't matter where it's at and what time in history, every society has some form of God. And the atheists will say, oh, that's because human superstition. No, it's written on your heart. There's a creator. And until you find that, until you really, like you said, until the heart is restless, until it rests in you, until you find what you're searching for, you're restless. And he was restless. That's why he was out there walking around trying to listen to, trying to hear what the world had to say to him, or what nature, or whatever it was that he thought was God at the moment. But he really came to realize it was the God of the Bible. But he was searching for truth. He was searching for meaning. He was searching for, is my life all just about drunken parties and having affairs? There's got to be more to life than this. And everyone knows that. Even people in like high society and like Hollywood celebrities that are going out and having all these, debauched parties and stuff, they're empty inside. And they're trying to fill it up with alcohol and drugs and sex and all these different things. And none of it will ever fill that God-shaped hole in your heart, because it's human nature. And until you find the God of the gospel, Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, until you find that, until you really have a relationship with Him, there's always going to be that emptiness. And you can try to fill it up with other things. You can try to fill it up with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but it only numbs that emptiness. It's just like any drug. Like if you're in pain and they give you morphine, it works, but only for a while. It isn't permanent until you fix the problem. Until you fix what's really, you've got gangrene in your leg. Until you fix that problem, morphine just numbs the pain for a while. It doesn't take the pain away. So all these other things that Augustine tried filling up the emptiness inside of him with, they would only numb it for momentary, painless moments, but it wasn't completely filling him up, and that's what he needed, and that's what he found.
And it just goes to show you that God can take you out of anywhere and supercharge your progress and make you like a superstar. I mean, He can take you and do great things with your life, no matter where you come from.
Yeah, no matter where you come from, no matter what you've done in the past, no matter what your past is, the future is endless. Every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. I really like that saying. There was a guy at a church I used to go to in California. It was a St. Charles Borromeo church, and I seen him a couple times outside of Mass, and I truthfully thought he was kind of a dangerous looking guy. He had tattoos all across his hands and his knuckles, all up his arms, on his neck, covered in tattoos, kind of a muscular guy with kind of looked like a motorcycle gang member. And then the one day I seen him, and he was, I don't know exactly what his position was, but he was an altar server, like an institute acolyte. He was maybe 40 years old or 50 years old, but he was the one that assisted the priest, and he was like the chief altar server. And I thought, I judge this man from outward appearances, and who knows where his life had taken him. Maybe he looked like prison tattoos, so maybe he was in prison for some horrible crime, but now obviously he's literally serving at the altar of God. And I judged him from outward appearances, but he's doing more than I am, because I'm just coming to church for 1 hour a week, and that was when, back when I wasn't even really taking it serious. And now I think, at the time, I didn't even really think of it. I was like, oh, okay, I was wrong about that guy. But now I think back and I think, I judged him, and I was wrong. Not only did I judge him, which you're not supposed to judge people like that, but I was wrong in my judgment, too.
Yeah. And most of the time we are, because we don't know the whole
Yeah.
story. We don't know
No, you don't know the
everything
whole
about
story.
everyone.
I mean,
Yeah.
he obviously had prison tattoos, but, St. Paul
Yeah.
murdered Christians. So
Yeah.
what you've done in the past doesn't really affect your current standing with God. A serial killer can come to Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't even matter. That's why the church doesn't definitively say if anyone is in hell. Like hell's real, and we know hell's real, and people go to hell if they cut themselves off from God. But the church won't say definitively Adolf Hitler's in hell, because it isn't our job to judge people to hell. You know what I mean? Like that's not our place. We don't get to make that decision.
Yeah.
You can make an educated guess as to where certain people are, but we don't know definitively. So there's no, you can't really judge the condition of someone's heart is really the whole point of that.